All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to what is now technically SLE 22B, which is the final 4 weeks of our 10-week class. So we finished 22A and had a little break, but it's all one course, really. And here we are kicking things off with some more Aristotle. So if you remember a little bit of Aristotle from last time around, but he has more to teach us. I hope you find this interesting as well. So a little mini review of Aristotle to get us going. In the Nicomachean Ethics, he was investigating the question of human happiness. And you may remember we substituted a different word for happiness. And that word was, that's right, flourishing. So the idea of doing really well at being a human being. So not necessarily happiness as a subjective state, the smile on our face. In fact, life can be quite tough, but maybe doing well in a tough life is actually what flourishing looks like. So it's a little more complicated of an idea. We have that image of the tomato plant that does really well, or the cat that we don't want to have living in a closet, but out in the world doing things that cats like to do. That's what flourishing looks like. And so you then had to ask the question of what does human flourishing look like? That led to the weird idea on Aristotle's part of asking about the human function. So weird, that use of the term function doesn't really sounds a little odd to us, I think. But he's trying to figure out, as with the tomato plant and as with the cat, what is distinctively human? What things should you be looking at if you're trying to figure out if a human being is doing really well or not? And he comes up with this kind of two-part answer. The first part is that we have something we call reason, that it's a kind of tool of our brains that can take all those ends, all those teloses. Remember all the different nesting of projects that we do are very complicated in this way. Indeed, I think we're unlike other animals when it comes to all the different things we pursue and the priorities we set. And so reason is the tool that allows us, makes that possible. Reason makes that possible. But it's not just reason that's the human function, because then everybody would be doing it anyway. So it's hard to know what excellence looks like. And so he combines that with what he calls human virtue. So our human function is to use that distinctively human capacity of reason in accordance with virtue. And so virtue, I think, is what we need to spend a little more time on. The quote, just so you can see it, once again, his actual words. And so the human good proves to be activity of the soul, the use of our reason, in accordance with virtue, and indeed in accord with the best and most complete virtue, if there are more virtues than one. So there it is, Aristotle's key to human happiness, human flourishing, the meaning of life, the use of our reason in accordance with virtue. All right, a little bit more about virtues. Now, virtue, too, I think is a little bit of a weird word. It's a little bit old-fashioned. It has certain sensibility about it that may mislead us a little bit. But I don't know. But the Greek word is tied to the idea of excellence. So it's somewhere. Virtue, I think, maybe gets us a little bit into kind of Christian religious values, maybe. Aristotle was just thinking in terms of human excellence, just this question of what is it to do really well as a human being. And so you can think of it as excellence as also, like, what does human excellence look like? Now, he doesn't make an argument for these the way he made an argument to get to this idea of reason in accordance with virtue. He kind of takes them for granted, and the Greeks kind of took them for granted. So he's not making these up. This is a time when the Greeks are talking about, the Greek community in general, their culture talks about justice and wisdom and courage and generosity and temperance, a whole big long list of virtues, the way we are supposed to be in the world. And so one way of thinking about that is as a personal quality, like, what kind of personal qualities should people have to be considered doing well at being human? So it's really more about character. Character. So remember, the title of the book is Nicomachean Ethics. It's another case where some people would argue ethics is not the best word. It's something more like character. It's an investigation of the ways of being in the world that we should have. So not necessarily right and wrong decision making, not rules about behavior, but a way of being. So right and wrong come into the mix, but it'd be wrong to think of it as just rules about morality. It's more about character. What kind of person are you? And I think that even though he doesn't make an argument for them, I think they're somewhat objective, that there's a compelling, it's compelling to think that these are part of being human. So it's hard to deny it, I think. So take the virtue of courage, for example. I think you could reasonably ask whether courage isn't something that is undeniably a good for a person. Isn't it reasonable to think that everybody, in order to be considered an excellent human being, would have some measure of courage? Like it seems to me an objectively good thing. And it's gonna get complicated, and we'll talk about it more. But it's hard to imagine the argument that would try to deny that courage is a good thing. So virtues tend to have this taken for granted goodness about them. Another one, maybe this is a little more complicated, is we take generosity. So generosity as a virtue, maybe this one feels a little more subjective in the sense that somebody could say, well, yeah, I think you shouldn't be generous. I think generous gets in the way of a flourishing life. But there too, I think it's reasonable to think that everybody, in order to be considered an excellent human being, should have some measure of generosity. So even if somebody chooses to not be a generous person, the idea, collective idea of an excellent person probably involves some generosity. And I think Aristotle would argue even a person who does not want to be very generous has to have some measure of generosity. So the virtues are these values of personal qualities, values of character. And then we have to start thinking about what those are and how best to talk about them. Because here's a problem, and it's probably already occurred to you. What is meant when I said some measure of generosity? What is meant by the some measure? Is it possible to be too generous? And at what point do we consider someone not generous enough? Where are those dividing lines? Same thing about courage, right? Can we be too courageous? Does it make sense to call somebody too courageous, or someone who's not quite courageous enough? So you pretty quickly find out that you have to develop a pretty refined language for thinking about these things, because they're not rules. They're not do this, don't do that, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt do this. They're not prescriptions. They're qualities of character. You have to find the sweet spot for them, and you have to base it on context, and you have to balance them against each other. So those are all tricky things about values of character that Aristotle wants to talk about. And in the next mini lecture, we'll tackle some of those wrinkles, and especially this idea of Aristotle's called the doctrine of the mean. Doctrine of the mean, how to find the sweet spot for those different characters, different qualities of character. So that's in the next mini lecture.